सारे लोगों का नेहरू डायलॉग्स और वेस्टलैंड की तरफ से। आप में से कई लोगों को यह पता है कि यह मासिक श्रृंखला है जो किसी किताब के इर्द गिर्द होती है और किसी विषय पर केंद्रित होती है। आज हमें बहुत खुशी है कि हमारे बीच रोलो रोमिग हैं, जिनकी किताब आई एम ऑन द हिट लिस्ट आप में से बहुत सारे लोगों ने पढ़ी होगी, और अगर नहीं पढ़ी है तो इसे ज़रूर पढ़ना चाहिए। और रोलो हिंदुस्तान में थे और अमृता ने कहा कि आज का ही दिन है जब हम बात कर सकते हैं, तो हमने गुजारिश की नेहा दीक्षित से, जिनसे भी आप सारे लोग परिचित हैं, द मेन लाइफ्स ऑफ साइडाइट्स की लेखिका, पत्रकार, उस किताब के पहले भी उनकी रिपोर्ट से आप लोग परिचित हैं। रोलो, बहुत स्वागत है आपका। और नेहा, आप दोनों के बीच ये बातचीत होगी।
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction and welcome all of you. I'm very happy to have this conversation with Rollo about his book because this afternoon I managed to finish the book, and I have to say that to understand what has been happening in India in the last 11 years, 12 years, it's really important that one reads his book because placing, like he writes in his book also, everything, he goes back to Indian epic tradition and says that every story has a meta story in it, or every story is a part of a meta story, you say. And in that context, Gauri's story, Gauri Lankesh, who was killed in 2017 because of the work she did, and Rollo brings together everything that Gauri had done and everybody around her, all the issues that were dominant in the times that she lived in. He puts all of those things in a context and tells us why we are here in New India and whatever is happening around us, things that disturb us, why have we reached this point. So thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you so much, Neha. I'm really, I'm so honored to be in conversation with you this evening because I'm such an admirer of your work. You're a much more accomplished journalist than I am, and I feel like I should be the one asking you questions just so I could learn how to write a book like the one you did, which really moved me profoundly. And it didn't just move me, it's so many, it's a book that does so many things. And, you know, well, I was mentioning earlier, Neha, that, you know, in some ways our books are interestingly similar, that both of us kind of examine the past 30 years of contemporary Indian history through the lens of one specific woman. But in most other ways, the books are incredibly different. Just the worlds they describe are remarkably different. And partly it's regional. You know, you're describing a woman in Delhi for the most part, and Gauri Lankesh obviously was based in Bangalore, which can feel like two entirely different countries. And you know, language, culture, all these things, but maybe most significantly class. That, you know, you're describing the life of a poor family. Nearly everyone who I'm writing about in my book is middle class, and that's probably the biggest cultural gap of all, is these class differences. It was something I was actually really struck by in researching the book, that not just this world of like journalists and writers and kind of their class position, but also the conspirators who murdered Gauri, or at least the ones who planned Gauri's murder, came from these distinctly middle-class backgrounds. Of course, the men who they put up to actually commit the murders tended to be, you know, in their own way, almost victims themselves, pushed into these acts as, you know, lower caste and poorer.
Sorry to interrupt
you,
but
please.
Let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
You spoke to a lot of people around Gauri,
yeah.
and you put together from people from her past, from the times that she was living in.
Yes.
You spoke to her friends, activists, fellow journalists.
Yes.
Tell us who Gauri was.
Well, it's such a complicated answer. I mean, the name of your book is Many Lives of Saida X. I easily could have named my book something similar because, you know, that was actually the thing that sustained me the most and ended up fascinating me the most over the time that I was working on this book. That, you know, she was such a complex person who went through many different phases in her life, and people who knew her in the 90s often sounded like they were describing a different person from people who knew her in the 2010s. Although many things remain the same, her liveliness, her passion, her sense of fun, her intense talent for friendship and for building community, like those were all there. But in many ways she evolved a lot over that time. And, you know, it's a book that, you know, obviously on some level it is the central mystery of it is this murder mystery of who killed her and why. But really what I found most fascinating was the mystery of who she was, which it was a mystery that even the people who knew her best, I felt, were grappling with after her death, especially after the enormous outpouring in response to her murder. In Bangalore itself, you know, tens of thousands of people came out, and there was such an incredible variety of people who came out in response to her murder in her home city, and so many of them seemed to have a close personal connection to her. And this was, I heard it again and again, that this was really surprising even to the people who thought they knew her best, that they didn't know all the other people whom she knew and had connected with. And that was fascinating to me. And it pointed in part to this work that she was doing very steadily, very thanklessly behind the scenes for many years of making connections, building community, cultivating friendship, which is really often a political act. We don't frame it that way. And it's work, you know? And she's someone who we think of as being primarily a journalist. And it's understandable, you know? Like when, I think most people, even in India, weren't familiar or weren't that familiar with her prior to her death. She was a local figure writing in Canada in the later part of her life. Certainly outside of India, she wasn't well known. But she instantly became this international figure when her murder became international news. It was assumed that what made her most significant was her journalism. It's an understandable assumption. I came to see it as being, not to downplay her journalism, but these other talents and this other work she was doing, these things that don't come with job titles, which are very often disregarded as women's work, you know, this work of community building and making connections between people. That was really what was essential in what she did, and that was when the people who lost her, that was where they found the gap most profoundly that no one else was filling.
Thank you for that, because in the book you mentioned how Gauri calls herself a journalist activist. And now a lot of us here in the last 10 years, sometimes we see that it's the conspiracy of the corporate media when they start calling some people journalist activists to sort of question their credibility or question what they are reporting on, or sometimes when they're focusing on public interest. But here Gauri herself is calling herself a journalist activist. A lot of friends you spoke to, her friends that you spoke to and you mentioned in the book, they also say that, you know, maybe she was not such a, you know, powerful journalist, but there were other things like you just mentioned that she did. What does it mean actually? Why did she call herself that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and actually by the end she'd flipped the equation and she described herself as an activist journalist, putting the word activist up front, very deliberately. And you know, she definitely didn't start out that way. You know, when she was starting her journalism career, writing for big national English language publications, her approach was very different. She absolutely did not think of herself as a journalist. This was a big evolution in her way of thinking about how one approaches journalism. She was trained in the same way that I was trained, that you should present your work as scrupulously neutral. And it was a formulation that she came to firmly reject. And uncoincidentally, she rejected that way of thinking when she left English journalism and started writing in Canada. And it started off by her taking over her father's newspaper. Her father was a very storied, beloved, notorious local journalist, kind of a one-of-a-kind figure, P. Lankesh. And he had this one-of-a-kind newspaper. When he died unexpectedly in the year 2000, she took it over, which was a big surprise to everyone because she actually wasn't even fully fluent in Kannada at that time. So she was not an obvious candidate for that job. And, but she really, rose to the occasion, quickly learned Kannada well enough to not just write for the paper, but edit it. And, but in switching to Kannada, one thing that she said again and again in her writing is that it plugged her into the ground realities of her state and her city in a way that she just never had access to before, writing in English. You know, when you write in English, as I know all too well as someone writing in English myself, your audience is vague. You don't know who you're writing for. It could be anyone who's been educated a certain way, and you never quite feel like you're directly writing to a person. When you're writing in Kannada, in Malayalam, in any more specific Indian language, you know exactly who your audience is, and you're going to hear from them, and there's going to be a dialogue. And it also just in many ways plugs you more directly into what's actually happening on the ground in a place. You know, English has become kind of the nowhere language. And that radicalized her, and getting plugged in that way. And she just increasingly felt that, neutrality is a false position. That neutrality is really just, for a journalist, is really just an endorsement of the status quo, which she found increasingly intolerable to endorse. And just was suspicious of this idea of why do we have to pretend to be neutral? All of us have, we can see what's happening. We can see when it's raining outside or when it's not raining outside. And we have to do our research. We have to be scrupulous in looking at multiple sides of every story. Not just that, but being imaginative enough to think about what are all the sides to the story. Not just 2, but 4, 5, 6, 7, 12 sides, But then after you've done that work, take a stance, I think was her position. And, I often feel that, there's this, in this insistence on neutrality, journalists are often forced into this intolerable forced equivalency, or false equivalency, where I hear so often, both here in India and back home in the US, in getting in conversations about what the right wing is doing, saying like, well, but both sides are extreme. That's part of the problem, is both sides are extreme. Actually, no. That's not true. Both sides are not extreme. Like, in the US, we have actual Nazis, proud to call themselves Nazis, who have returned. We do not have an equivalent of that on the left, not even close. Only one side is explicitly endorsing, hate and cruelty. It's not happening from the other direction, and we have to be honest about that. In my country also, I'm sure you've heard about Zoran Mamdani, who's, now the Democratic nominee for mayor of my city, New York City. And, they're trying to paint him as Chairman Mao, his actual proposals are free buses, which actually has been tried before in a pilot program and it's happened in other cities. It was fine. It's worked well. Freezing the rent happened 2 mayors ago, wasn't a big deal. And raising taxes on the ultra-rich by 2%. Like these are the radical communist policies. Like, come on, this is like, it's actually pathetic to think of these as radical positions.
So you mentioned, sorry to interrupt,
please,
you
yeah.
mentioned in your book also that Gauri had 70 cases against her, 7-0.
Yeah.
Right, and we are often laugh about it, like a couple of, I have some cases in Guwahati and I keep telling friends now that I've seen all of Northeast and thank God my cases are in Guwahati. And similarly, you mention in the book that because Gauri had all these cases, she knew all the nice eating places all across Karnataka because of these court cases. So we do manage to, look at the silver lining and somehow operate. But I want to understand from you, what is it that she did that led to these many cases against her? What were the issues that she was looking at, working on, reporting on, doing activism around? What were these issues?
Yeah, well, it was a variety of things, and her paper had a pretty broad mandate in what it was covering, and she managed to anger a lot of different kinds of people, which is partly why when she was murdered, there were a lot of suspects. There were a lot of people who were called in to, partly all these many people who had filed cases against her, and it wasn't all just in one category. There were unscrupulous businessmen. There was religious leader who'd been accused of rape, who she wrote about a lot in her paper. But especially single-mindedly, increasingly single-mindedly, she was writing about the right wing, BJP, RSS, and its entire constellation, and just the direction that things were going, that they were taking things. And so a lot of the cases related to that. The specific case that she was actually found guilty in, not long before she died, she was found guilty in a defamation case where some BJP legislators had been accused of complicity in a crime. I don't recall the details of the crime right now, but every other paper hadn't named the names, but she named the names. And so she actually was found guilty in this case and was out on bail. She was actually supposed to serve jail time and was out on bail awaiting appeal when she died. And Tom, what was the other part of the question now?
So that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask another one so
Yeah,
that
please,
you can
yeah,
answer
please.
both, which is
Yeah.
that she's one of the few Indian women journalists, activists who have been murdered. And in his book, he speaks to many of her friends who describe her in different ways. But, so some people, of course, there are all these stereotypes about women, right? That if you're an independent person, a woman, then of course you must be doing drugs. And of course, if you're single and with no children, of course you're like this. And at some point, someone has said she behaved like a 16-year-old. So that's also an accusation of sort. So why, and then at some point, Gauri herself in the book says that somebody says, oh, you're a woman and you're doing this. And Gauri says, I am a woman and that's my security.
That's right.
Now,
Yeah.
so it's really complex, the fact that a woman who's not fitting into that stereotype within the Indian patriarchal system, and at the same time, she thinks that that is going to keep her safe. Why do you think they went after this woman? And what is it about her being the way she was offended this whole system?
Well, they did seem particularly outraged by the way that she conducted her personal life. And this came up time and time again when I would interview virtually anyone from the right about Gauri. They would, they'd start off and say, oh, of course it's terrible, of course murder is wrong, but then they'd start sneaking in these insinuations about her personal life. And then they would realize that they'd gone a little too far and say, oh, but of course murder is wrong. But they made sure to get these points in, that she smoked and that she drank. She proudly smoked and drank. I mean, she made a point of smoking and drinking, in part because she knew that it annoyed the people who she wanted to annoy. So she was definitely deliberately provocative in some ways. She also just wanted to smoke and drink. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. You know, you mentioned when we were speaking earlier that she's possibly the only woman journalist who's been assassinated. There's unfortunately a long list of journalists who've been assassinated in this country, but I don't recall coming across another example of a woman journalist who's been assassinated. Of course, women journalists come under much worse attack when it comes to threats, as unfortunately you know all too well. That all journalists are getting trolled, but women obviously are getting a much uglier version of trolling, and probably more incessant. But it did come as a shock, though, that they decided to murder a woman. I remember, you know, well, this is in the book too, but there's actually this local mafia don, former mafia don in Bangalore, Agni Sridhar, who, oddly enough, Gauri knew really well when she was a teenager. It's kind of a long story. But I talked to him often when I was in Bangalore, and he talked about what a shock it was for, you know, members of the criminal underworld that these guys had killed a woman. And he was saying, like, according to our honor code, this would be unthinkable. So it did seem like kind of crossing a barrier in a certain way, even though the rape threats and all this other stuff don't seem to cross any barriers at all for them.
You know, in the book, it's really fascinating. There's a chapter that speaks about Gauri's Lingayat identity and the fact that she was increasingly one of the public figures who were trying to delink Lingayat community from Hinduism, right? So they wanted to have a separate identity and not linked to Hinduism. And at the same time, you also mentioned that after her murder, when there was investigation, they found out that it was not her journalism, but actually a 2012 speech that she had made on which started with what is Hinduism, and she starts questioning various aspects of Hinduism. And in the book, there is a lot of Rollo has looked at Sanatan Sanstha deeply, which has been accused in Gauri's case. So, would you like to talk more about Sanatan Sanstha and tell everybody what is it, what do they believe in, and how were they instigated by what Gauri did?
Sure. So Sanatan Sanstha is this small but actually increasingly influential fringe group, a fringe religious group based out of Goa. They have an ashram in Goa, and they've been connected with not just Gauri's murder, but the murder of, you know, the three writers in the same pattern that preceded her murder, Dastkar, Pansari, and Kalburgi, which all ended up, you know, as many people suspected, being connected, although none of the cases have completed trial. But not just that, but many of their members have been accused of various bombings, really terrorist bombings, especially of cinemas and theaters, like live theater playhouses, that were showing productions that they didn't approve of. So yeah, fringe religious group. But you know, groups like this are always described as fringe, but fringe in what way? Like, they're fringe in the way that, in the sense that their beliefs are absolutely extreme, but when you look at their political program, which is primarily focused on establishing a Hindu Rashtra, there's not much daylight between what they want and between what the ruling party wants. You know, so can you call them fringe when actually their ideas are absolutely mainstream positions? In fact, you know, they have their Sanatan Sanstha hosts every year a convention that takes place in Goa that collects people from, you know, right-wing fringe groups all over the country, collect there, a conference on establishing a Hindu Rashtra. And just the year before he was elected prime minister, Modi sent them a letter of congratulations for the conference and his regrets that he couldn't be there. So it just shows just how closely connected ideologically. And, it's one of these groups that, like, I see a very similar pattern with extreme right-wing groups in the US, where they serve a really valuable role for the right-wing political parties, that, they can kind of test the waters and also push the limits of what is possible to say and do. And that depending on which way the political winds are blowing, the political parties can either embrace them or distance themselves from them. But they serve a really valuable role in pushing a country rightward. And it's significant that they're not part of the Sangh Parivar, although their politics really aren't that much different.
And you do write about how they say that elimination of evildoer is the most important tenet. It's actually, they call it non-violence when you eliminate an evildoer.
That's right.
It was it's very interesting because in his book he talks about how they measure the percentage of your spirituality,
yes,
right, to attain sainthood. So if anybody above 80% is a saint, and the founder has 94% something, has achieved 94% spirituality or something like that.
He's still working on the last 6%.
So what are those methods? How do they measure it?
It's really interesting because they've got this kind of pseudo-scientific framework for everything that they do. They actually remind me a lot of Scientology, yes, in the United States, where they've got all these kind of made-up metrics, and they even have these devices. Like, they've got this device that looks like a ray gun from a science fiction movie that measures the aura of certain objects. And so, like, they would point it at the guru's lunch and say, like, oh, well, his lunch emits, an aura that's 8 times as wide as a normal lunch. And it's all very precise. I'm trying to remember what I was going to say about, about the...
evildoers.
Yes, exactly. And so they also produce an enormous amount of literature in multiple languages. They've got many publications, both periodicals and books. And the guru, who's actually Jayantat Vale, who's actually a recluse, no one's seen him in public in at least 20 years. He's written many books. And one of the books was found in the possession of a number of the conspirators when they were arrested. And it's a book that's really, and it's in English, so it's very direct. Nothing's lost in translation when I read it, and it's very explicitly just a manual for murder. It's on no uncertain terms, and exactly like you're saying, destroy the evildoers. And he makes a point several times in the book to say, to be clear, I'm not speaking metaphorically. When I say destroy the evildoers, I'm talking about shooting and murdering people. It's that clear. And he says things like, it's all this specific advice, like when you're aiming the gun, chant God's name, and that will ensure that the bullet hits, but that also you will not be held culpable for it. All these instructions very directly about murdering people, and how you compile lists of whom to kill. They recommend their own newspaper for compiling hit lists because the newspaper often highlights people who they consider traitors to Hinduism. And he's been untouched. They've actually done a pretty remarkable job of separating the leader and all other active members of Sanatana Sanstha from culpability. Despite this, what you would think would be, this very obvious evidence, he's never been arrested. The Sanatana Sanstha is more influential than it's ever been. It's actually, these murders have actually raised their profile, increased their recruitment. And you see them you may have even seen them yourselves. Their spokesmen occasionally appear on TV news channels to represent Hindu opinion on various matters.
Uh, because everybody sitting here in some way is an evildoer in the eyes of Sanatana.
I would imagine so,
I'm very
yeah.
sure of it. But I do want to ask you, in the book you mention, and that's where you get the name of the book, Gauri says that there is a hit list, I am on that hit list. And she did have a list where she appeared and there were many other people. And in the book you also say that after her killing, a cop told Kavita, her sister, that because of her killing, everybody else on the list was saved.
Yeah.
So tell us more about this list.
Yeah.
Who were the people who were part of this list and they were being targeted?
So, it was something of a, as this pattern of murders became clear, Dastkar, Pansari, Kalburgi, all shot with the exact same modus operandi, two men on a motorcycle using the exact same kind of pistol, seemingly targeted for similar reasons, shot on their doorsteps. There was obviously a pattern here, and it became kind of a dark joke among Gauri and some of her colleagues to talk about being on the list. But obviously they knew that there was a list in some sense. They didn't know how literal it was, but it turned out to be quite literal, that the police found two different lists in notebooks, because actually the conspirators left behind a lot of documentary evidence. They had notebooks that one thing that Sanatana Sanstha encourages is actually to do a lot of journaling. So their members are encouraged to write their thoughts, and especially to write down kind of their sins. So if they're struggling with a particular sin in their mind, they're supposed to journal about it. So lots and lots of material for the police to work with when they uncovered this stuff. But included in these notebooks were at least two different hit lists. On one of the lists, the next person on the list was K.S. Bhagwan, who is kind of a deliberately notorious figure in Karnataka because he says all kinds of very intentionally inflammatory things about Hinduism. And he's kind of a remarkable person because he's completely unafraid. He's a literary scholar. He's translated multiple Shakespeare plays. That's his day job. But it seems like what he really enjoys most is saying inflammatory things. And then he doesn't seem to mind at all that he gets these threats. But they were actually quite close to assassinating him, and the plans were pretty far developed. He is actually, though, followed everywhere by two armed policemen who protect him, and they're armed policemen stationed permanently at his home. This was something that Gauri rejected out of hand. She was offered that at one point when it became clear that she was someone under unusual threat, and she absolutely rejected it out of hand. She said, I can't have a policeman following me around when I'm trying to interview people.
You also, in the book, write in great detail about the nameless assassin group.
Yeah.
The people involved, and you also talk about SIT, which had some 226 cops working under it, and 18 people were mentioned in the charge sheet. Most of them had connections with Sanatana Sanstha. Talk to us more about who are these people, what was this group, how did the SIT work, and what was your assessment of what they did in the case?
Yeah, so, the Special Investigation Team, when they started work, like you said, at its peak it had over 200 police officers assigned to it, extraordinary amount of resources, but even so, there was a lot of cynicism in Bangalore around there being any hope that there would be progress in the case. Largely because of how disastrous the previous investigations had gone into the killings of Dastkar, Pansari, and Kalburgi. I mean, there were many outrageous errors. Even calling them errors seems generous in some cases, that the police made in those cases. Maybe the most outrageous being that the Pune police, in investigating Daskar's murder, enlisted a man who claimed to be a spirit medium he was a former cop who had reinvented himself as a spiritualist, and he claimed that he could get Dastar's soul to inhabit his body, and that he would then tell them who had killed him, in Dastar's own words. Dastar, of course, being most significant as an anti-superstition campaigner. If anything, it just underlined the necessity of his work. This just wasted a lot of police time. Obviously, it didn't result in anything positive. And so, after all these, those cases had already been going for years with no progress. And then there wasn't progress in Gauri's case for months at first, also, as you might recall. But then it turned out that the police were being quiet, not because they had nothing, but because they were actually very deliberate, and because they were acting professionally, for the most part. And they wouldn't talk to me for several years, which I actually took as a good sign that they didn't want to just blab to every journalist who came to town, And ultimately, they spent a lot of time with me after they felt that they'd really cracked the case. But yeah, then in the spring of 2018, they started steadily arresting people, and ultimately arrested 17 people. The 18th person who was accused is still absconding. And then, so that was 2018, most arrests. Trial didn't start until 2022, 4 years later, partly due to COVID, but partly due to all the struggles that we all know well in the Indian justice system. And trial is still ongoing with no end in sight. 3 years after it began, it meets maximum 5 days a week. Rarely that often, though. And all of the accused have now gotten bail in the case. And were, of course, garlanded and fed sweets by the usual suspects when they came out of jail.
My last question before we open it to the others to ask questions. I want to ask you, why did you write this book? And why is Gauri's story the story of New India?
Yeah, I feel so lucky to have been able to write this book and just to have had access to the world that Gauri inhabited and to meet so many of these different people who she touched and connected with. It's just been the great privilege of my life to be able to do that. I started reporting in South India in 2013, mostly for the New York Times Magazine, and really, it's partly I got into it by marriage. My wife is from Kerala. Her book is actually also published by Westland, and it's on the table back there, Airplane Mode. I'm biased, but I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book about, it's a history of travel and tourism, but told through a very post-colonial lens. In many ways, it's a book that's about sort of the experience of trying to travel the world on an Indian passport and all the obstacles that come your way, and using that as an opportunity to tell the history of things like passports and visas and borders. I started coming to India just on family visits with her, but quickly just started doing most of my journalism here, and really immediately wanted to focus on South India because, American publications, when they cover India at all, tend to be very Delhi-focused, and journalists, even when they're based here, foreign correspondents tend not to travel far from Delhi. And what impressed me most from the beginning about India is its extraordinary variety, diversity, pluralism, and I just I kind of made it my mission to, at least for these American magazines, to just try to show different sides of the country. And I'd always been looking for a book that would do something similar, and then, when Gauri was murdered, I wrote about it for the Times Magazine, and then just found that I couldn't really let it go. And that I knew, very early on working on that magazine story that I was just getting started with it, and there was just too much to say that could be contained in even a long magazine story. So yeah, I felt like I almost didn't have a lot of choice in the matter.
And why is Gauri's story the story of New India? Because you've very effectively and comprehensively told us what has happened in the last 10, 11 years and why it led to what happened to Gauri and whatever we are facing right now. Many of the people you mention in the book who Gauri called her sons, right? Umar is in jail, many other people are in jail. And Gauri was deeply concerned about these people. And now that she is gone, still many people continue to face the things that she was afraid of. Why is her story the story of New India?
I guess she is someone who you can tell the story of this India through. But as you've demonstrated with your book, there are so many Indians who that's true of, you know? And I just feel like there are countless people who you could choose that you could frame a book around the same way and tell a very different story. Because even as you've all lived through this same experience of these recent years, there are just so many Indias at once that it can't be contained in the story of one person. So I think it's really useful to use one person's life as a lens onto what's been happening, but it can never tell anything close to an entire story. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rollo. Thank you, Neha. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.